שלום לכם, ברוכים הבאים לפרק מיוחד של שומר סף, והאורח שלי היום הוא דיויד, הוא ראש מחלקת מחקר של ריביות, מטח ושווקים מתעוררים בבנק של אמריקה, בנק אוף אמריקה לשעבר. הוא התחיל את הקריירה שלו ב-International Monetary Fund, הוא כתב דוקטורט תחת ריצ'רד קלרידה שהיה סגן ראש ה-Federal Reserve ועשה עוד הרבה דברים חשובים. Hello, David.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to have you. And the occasion that brought us together were the alarm in Israel about the foreseen damage caused allegedly by the coming reform. What is your take on that?
Personally, listen, I have to say, you know what, I'm not Jewish, but I do live in Israel. So from that point of view, like, you can look at me as a, unbiased, impartial observer in all this. What I can tell you is this, I've done this for 30 years, my whole career has been literally devoted to looking at economies, looking at politics, telling basically investors where to basically place their money. I think it's completely ridiculous what the left has been saying of late here in Israel, that judicial reform is going to bring about the destruction of the Israeli economy.
Can you, despite not agreeing with the argument, can you imagine what it is based on? What's the logic behind the idea that a judicial reform of this kind can have such an impact on the economy?
I think, first of all, let me just give you my overall, interpretation reading of what's actually going on here in Israel. And the only thing that can destroy this economy is if the left, goes all the way to weaponize the economy in order to destroy everything that is valuable in this country in order to basically retain power. I think what is going on here, there's no question, it's about a power struggle. What is going to bring down the economy is not the judicial reform itself, but rather the fact that the left is willing to, again, basically push the economy to the brink in order to basically take the government hostage in order to force themselves into this process. I think this is a very important thing. This is what your viewers need to understand. This is a very big difference. Because I can give you an example. Perfect example, right? Right now, you've got people, elite in Israel, who are comparing Israel with Turkey. I think that comparison is almost like idiotic. I can tell you a much fairer comparison. You know what the country is? Singapore. Singapore, I know a lot of Israelis aspire for Israel to become the next Singapore, which I think is a generally stupid idea, but it doesn't really matter, Singapore is an aspiration. It started with Paris, if you remember. Now all the left, all the people who live in parts of the Patua, Fashmao, they all want to basically become the next Singapore. Guess what? In the Freedom House democracy score in 2022, Singapore only got 47 out of 100 points. Versus Israel that got something like 75 points out of 100. Because guess what? Singapore, you don't have judicial independence. There's no real democracy. The opposition party has absolutely no chance of ever becoming elected. There is no actually even free speech. There's no even LGBT rights. This is why Singapore actually, in democracy terms, is actually a poor performer. Yet Singapore today is a AAA rated country. People cannot basically wait to put more money into Singapore. So, Israel is more free than Singapore, and yet Singapore enjoys basic AAA credit rating. So how do you explain that? It tells you that actually, and I think there's no chance Israel, following the judicial reform, is going to become like Singapore, politically speaking. I think that in general is stupid. But what I'm saying that the whole argument that somehow
is upside down.
There is democracy, a loss of democracy means that loss of economic power. There's no correlation, because the best example, Singapore today is the 4th richest country in the world in per capita terms. It's $100,000 basically a year per capita economy. It's one of the most dynamic economies in the world, without doubt. And yet, it's a laggard in democracy.
I have some criticism of these, of Freedom House and the other the other kinds of democracy measurements, because it's been my opinion for a long time that these things measure liberalism but don't measure democracy at all. So they have no category to see that Israel is no longer a democracy. Israel has, because in all these scales, judicial reform counts only in the, judicial independence counts only in the positive. But what if you have a judiciary that is so strong that it's usurping citizen sovereignty? And this is what we have in Israel. We basically have a court which has taken for itself, without permission, the authority to take final decisions on everything, including the writing of our Constitution. And they are not elected. They have a veto on the appointment of their own associates. So I think that if you took the Freedom House scale and put Israel in it, what would really happen? The whole scale should topple over. But in trying to imagine how a legal reform can impact the economy, the one thing that I know, I have friends who are businessmen, and what happened in Israel is, since the court is imperial, and since it has employed a theory of interpretation that is so wild that it actually said that the court can rule in business matters in direct opposition to the language of the contract, because it knows what the parties should have meant. So the courts have created a state of complete chaos legally. And this judicial reform is designed to create a measure of certainty in contracts. Would that, in your opinion, have any beneficial impact in the long run?
I think, honestly, I don't think that is a decisive factor. I know people talk about it. I don't think it's that important. I think far more important is the fact that in Israel, the Supreme Court basically, looks at far too many cases. The Supreme Court involves itself in things that it's not the business of Supreme Court, at least nowhere else in the world, right? In the US, the Supreme Court receives about 10,000 petitions every year. They choose less than 100 to consider, and then when they do consider these things, like all the Supreme Court justices are involved in the deliberation, okay? They only take on cases that have huge impact with respect to the entire economy, lots of people, the Constitution, so on and so forth. In Israel, the Supreme Court oversees 10,000 cases. By definition, okay, the Supreme Court in Israel is much too active for its own benefit. Good example, of course, is what they did in 2016, trying to kill Bibi's basically plan to develop the Israeli gas field. Now, we can all agree now, 6 years later, the best decision Israel's ever made in the last 10 years, one of the great accomplishments of Bibi was to push through the gas development project, which, if you recall, the Supreme Court was trying to kill. And that was way beyond the jurisdictional, basically, domain of the Supreme Court. What competency do they bring to the table to decide whether that is a good thing or a bad thing for Israel? Meanwhile, the decision to basically dismiss the petitions against giving up all that gas fields to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, you know what? Again, they didn't even give you a reason why they decided to dismiss the case. So from that point of view, to me, the problem with the justice system here in Israel is that, first of all, the Supreme Court gets involved in too many things that really is beyond their competency, their core competency. So from that point of view, that's probably slowing things down. At the same time, but I do think in the end, if there's something seriously wrong with the Supreme Court, is that this Supreme Court is basically part of the leftist deep state here in Israel. And all they're trying to do is trying to basically say, no, whatever is coming from, basically the right. So from that point of view, yeah, they're not doing anything other than just trying to undermine, basically any government that's run by the rights. And then I think, from that point of view, I can understand why there's so much frustration among conservative, basically, voters here in Israel. Why, basically, like, you vote for the right and you're not getting right policies, because guess what? The Supreme Court is overextending itself to basically slow down the changes that the democratically elected government wants to push through here.
This is not just an Israeli phenomenon. If you look at, in the United States, a little bit more complex, but if you look at the growth of what they call, in a confusing term, international law, and if you look at the structure of the European Union, you see that there is judicial imperialism, because the whole structure is not exactly democratic, but the laws governing the economy were extended. The EU laws were extended to override the laws of the sovereign state by the European Court of Justice, not by the European public. Are there parallels that you see between?
I think there's some parallel, but the German Supreme Court, by the way, can still basically decide that something is not compatible with German Constitution. So from that point of view, I think the issue here is this. I think where there's parallel is about whether basically people who are in the position of power, whether they are representative, whether they're elected representatives by the people, right? Clearly we know the EU Commission, right? The people who are there, the bureaucrats, they're not even elected by the people, not even by the European people for that matter, basically. They're basically appointees, and then basically they're bureaucrats. And yet they have this massive, basically powerful role within Europe, trying to implement policies that may or may not basically be consistent with the aspirations of the national people. Here in Israel, it's the same thing, because all these basically justices who are basically not elected by the people, who are now trying to basically change the way the country is run, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, I think from that point of view, there's no now that I think, to me, the most urgent issue to address in this judicial reform is obviously the whole selection process of the justices. I mean, it's just impossible that the justices should be basically, partly nominated by each other. Okay, so you create this very sort of like, basically, the bureaucrats, electing other bureaucrats, like-minded bureaucrats, so they started to think alike. There is no basically political diversity within the Israeli basically Supreme Court system. And I think from that point of view, that is very unusual. I mean, that I think must be unique in the world, because if you think about this U.S., right? I know the U.S. better than a lot of other countries. Simply, I lived in the U.S. for a very long time. I know, live in Europe also in 10 years. But the point here is, if you think about the U.S., right? Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president, but only requires a simple majority vote in the Senate for confirmation. In other words, the president doesn't even have to control the House of Representatives to be able to push through his Supreme Court appointments. So from that point, it's a purely political, basically, appointment. But the president is elected by the people, and basically the Senate is elected by the people. The fact in Israel that somehow the left is against the government, the Knesset, from being able to appoint justices, that to me is almost insane. Yeah. Because that doesn't make any sense at all, because that is completely undemocratic. So I think from that point of view, it's the same thing like about the bureaucrats in Brussels who are not democratically put in place. The Israeli justices until now, they're far removed from being part of the product of the democratic process.
And everywhere in the three arenas that we mentioned, Israel, Europe, and the United States, it seemed that these elites, whether entrenched in the courts like they are in Israel and in Europe, whether the court is more pluralistic like in America, but it seems that these elites are at bottom not just anti-nationalist, but also at least non-democratic. Would you say this is so in the United States as well?
Of course. I mean, listen. I mean, we know this, right? I mean, if you go to the World Economic Forum, the way they talk about the people, I mean, with such disdain, right? Because I mean, these globalists, all they want, they think that people actually don't know what is really good for them. They would love to be able to have a system that's run by a bunch of oligarchs telling people what is actually in their best interest. I think the reality is this. I don't know if the Israeli left, are internationalists or not. But what I do know is that a lot of these guys, all they ever want is that when they go abroad, they want to be embraced by these foreigners saying, well, you great Israelis. Right now, I can understand it's difficult to be an Israeli when you travel abroad, especially in Europe and America, right? Especially Europe, where I think there's a lot of anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. I understand that Israelis want to be loved when they travel abroad, which is actually ironic because Jews were kicked out of Europe. And yet these Israeli basically leftists, all they ever want is to be basically accepted by the Europeans. Which is a real contradiction here. I live in Israel. I could live anywhere in the world. I live in Israel today, other than the fact my wife is Israeli, my family, I've got 4 grandchildren here in Israel. I love Israel because I still believe in Israeli democracy. I think there's a more vibrant democracy here in Israel than anywhere else. To the extent, to me, the basis of democracy is freedom of speech. I still think that Israelis are allowed to express themselves more freely than people can elsewhere. This is why we're having this discussion. That's why you have the #1, basically, a YouTube channel, in Israel for conservative right. It's possible. But I think the fact that, that the right is pushing back against the left, I think that is amazing. Because we're not seeing that anywhere else, by the way.
So there's certainly a reason for optimism. The first reason for optimism is the re-election of Netanyahu. Despite his trial, many Israelis just believe he was framed. But if you look at the role of the judiciary vis-a-vis freedom of speech, the left likes to quote a famous decision that where the Supreme Court reversed a government decision to close a communist newspaper. But they forget to mention that the Supreme Court, against the law, ordered the closing of a right-wing radio station when there was a monopoly for public broadcasting, but you could broadcast from outside Israel. So there was a pirate radio station called The Voice of Peace by A.B. Natan that they left alone, but when there was a right-wing radio, they closed it. And I've been working in journalism for a long time. It's still an uphill battle to voice right-wing opinion, but some of this is just social delegitimization, as you probably know.
But I want to say that's actually very interesting to me, because I think Israel was sort of like the first country where, the left took over the media and controlled the media. Right? In fact, I would argue that the Americans have been learning from Israel, because until Trump came along, U.S. was a very different country in terms of the media and so on and so forth. U.S. really took a chapter out of the Israeli playbook. To the extent the left basically took over the media, and then now it's wokeism, the political correctness completely over. Now there's only Fox News. If you think about it in the U.S., it's absolutely crazy. There's not a single major newspaper, other than you can call it the New York Post being a major newspaper, that actually embraced the right. So from that point of view, U.S. has gone the way of Israel from, I would say, 10 years ago. But Israel, on the other hand, now you have, Israel Hayom, you have others. So from that point of view, it's almost as though that, the U.S., I would say, is probably 5 or 6 years behind Israel.
But we are behind you on the front of Fox News, and now there's an emerging channel that we are very optimistic by the rating. And it's my theory of what's happening to the media more and more. They've become what Andre Mir, the scholar of journalism, called post-journalistic. They're not dealing in reporting. They're dealing in political activism, and it's a conscious decision. But what is happening is that the trust of the readers is sinking. So once you lied about the Hunter Biden laptop and only admitted it a year and a half later, the price in the long run is that people would believe you less. So I'm very optimistic about our market. Now there's been a purge in Channel 13. There was a purge before in Galei Tzahal, the radio station, the purging of the right, but the public trust is sinking in those sectors. Do you see in the United States any prospect of a more fruitful dialogue between the two sides? Because from the view from Israel is that there's now two countries, Red America and Blue America, and they don't even know each other.
So just interesting because, I mean, this whole issue around polarization is something very important to me because, I mean, on one hand, you know, we look at the world today, I think there are two major themes happening, right? One is the polarization between, you know, the developed, you know, US-led Western nations versus the so-called global South, right? I mean, that's a polarizing force. Another polarizing force, of course, is political polarization within the countries themselves, right? Now, one of the things that I do is, like, you know, I joined forces with Rewe. Rewe is a Canadian company listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. They are actually the #1 online survey technology company, okay, in the world. I mean, they conduct surveys for a lot of, you know, let's put it this way, intelligence agencies in the world, because they conduct surveys in many countries where there are no surveys. And one of the surveys we're doing, actually, we've been doing this for the past year, is trying to basically measure polarization, okay, within basically the G7 countries, so the US, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, UK, and Italy. And what we find is that you'd be surprised. You know, like right now, something like 58% of Americans consider the United States to be either very or extremely polarized politically. Okay, since the war in Ukraine started, you know, clearly it's been a hugely divisive issue in Germany. Now, 52% of Germans feel like over the next 5 years, polarization is going to get much worse. Okay, so in fact, 50% of the respondents across all these countries, including basically UK and Canada, say that basically political polarization has become a major basically driver of political instability. You know, if we're talking about basically, you know, economic damage to the economy, you know, stemming from the judicial reform, the only possible source of this damage will come from basically extreme polarization that brings about political stability, instability, right? If tomorrow, and again, I don't want to basically go down this path, but I have no doubt the left here in Israel, they feel that if they lose this battle, okay, they're going to be gone, possibly forever. I mean, to the extent that given the demographic changes, given that more and more people realize that, you know, Oslo was basically a fantasy and so on and so forth, that the right is gaining more and more people. If the left loses the court process, they're done. This is why they are going to stake everything. They're going to put everything into play. I would not surprise me that, you know, they're willing to go all the way meaning that, you know what, people can stop paying taxes, people can stop going to, refusing to go to the army, whatever it is. They can do that to basically bring about a complete political breakdown in the country. But that, to me, of course, is very blind, very stupid, because in the end, they're going to do more harm than good to the country. But to me, I would not underestimate the willingness of the left to destroy the country if that's what it takes to be able to save it from what they see as ridiculous, basically risk.
A lot of people are threatening to pull their money out, many of them successful high-tech companies. How dangerous could that be to our economy in the short run?
That, I have to say, is the most stupid thing somebody ever said. You know what? People who are in business, they're in business because all they're trying to do is to make money. Just think about it this way, right? I can understand, like, you just think about, like, people who could take their money out of Israel, right? By the way, just so that people actually understand the numbers, right? Israeli external debt, that is like the amount of debt issued by the Israeli government that's held by foreigners, okay? Non-residents, okay? It's about like $140 billion, something like that. Guess what? Israeli foreign exchange reserve is about $200 billion. If tomorrow every foreigner decides to basically sell their holding of Israeli government bonds because they think Israel is going to get downgraded, they want to basically ship out, there's plenty of reserves left to basically accommodate their exit. And I'm not saying that's even remotely possible, but that's what. Businesses is even more ridiculous, right? Let's just imagine if you are like, you are a billionaire in Israel, you say, well, all you care is basically making money, right? Are you telling me that you're going to shut down your business? You're going to shut down your business as a way to protest the government? That would be kind of very stupid because for all you know, 2 years down the road, there could be another election, the left might come back into power, and then your business would have been already shut down, because a business, you cannot basically like turn off and turn it back on again. If you decide to basically shut down your business, you're gonna fire everybody, close down shop, and that's it. There'll be nothing left. So from that point of view, it's not a credible strategy, even as a threat. Now, high tech, this is actually, it's very, very interesting, right? You think about this, right? There is Silicon Valley, and there's Israel, right? They exist because, technology firm startups, they thrive within some kind of ecosystem, right? So it's not like, okay, fine, let's basically move your tech company to Greece, or you're gonna move your company to even Britain, or whatever it is, because there's a certain synergy of having lots of basically startup companies all coming out of the army, whatever, familiarity, developments, all that. That you cannot move tomorrow, okay? Now, unless you're telling me that Intel, Microsoft, and Cisco are all going to be basically like firing everybody and saying, no, we're going to go. But that's even more ridiculous. Because at the end of the day, these companies don't care whether, they're going to be serving bread or not in hospitals basically during Passover. Believe me, they don't care, right? What they care is being able to access skilled labor, tech basically programmers at a reasonable price. That's what they care about. So from that point of view, they don't care. I mean, do they really gonna care if there's gonna be one fewer settlement, one more settlement? I don't think so either. The left has been going after Bibi on these legal charges for many years. In fact, the last 2 years, we had, so-called leftist government that could have basically, find evidence to bring Bibi down. If they spend all these years, they cannot bring Bibi down because they don't have sufficient evidence to basically indict him, charge him, whatnot. Either, Bibi's innocent, or that the judges are completely incompetent. In either case, you know what? If that's the case, either if Bibi's innocent, then there's no issue. If Bibi is not innocent, but the judicial system is no good, then let's reform the system. You cannot basically, the problem with the left here is that you cannot basically have the cake and eat it too. And what I see in the US is Americans copying what's been going on in Israel. Except I think at least in Israel, people understand the game. This is why the right won with a pretty sizable majority by Israeli standard, because people get the joke. Like, in Israel, like people are smart. Politics is in people's blood. Nobody actually gets completely like brainwashed like in the US these days. I think Israelis can see through all this hypocrisy, and this is why Bibi's prime minister in Lapid today.
So my last question would be about the United States. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Because you sounded pessimistic about America as compared to Israel.
Yeah. I'm quite pessimistic about the US right now. And I think, and this is a long conversation, this is a very long conversation, but my pessimism stems from the fact that they're doing everything too late. The number one focus in the US at the moment is to kill China. If you look at the history of the United States for most of the last 50 years, right, 60 years even since, you can argue even 100 years since Woodrow Wilson, it's been basically, a tug of war between the internationalist versus the realist, right? The internationalists, like Woodrow Wilson, they want to create basically, basically the League of Nations, which became the United Nations.
To make the world safe for democracy.
Exactly, right? So from that point of view, Americans basically invested heavily in international organization, which it basically ruled over anyway to basically dictate American hegemony, which no doubt helped America. I'm not saying it didn't help the rest of the world until recently, but that was basically the story, right? But it then became very obvious by 2008, what brought down the crisis and so on and so forth was the fact that this globalization, of American power basically benefited the elite in the US, but left basically most of Americans, I'm talking about average middle-class Americans, basically in the dirt, right? I mean, we all know about the manufacturing jobs that were lost, but for every manufacturing job lost, guess what? There were 5 other jobs that went away with it, okay? So from that point of view, there's no doubt that globalization, the way, that was benefiting the American lead, big American corporation, benefiting US defense companies because they were selling lots of arms, and so on and so forth, right? Did not basically benefit the average American. And that's when Trump came along in 2016. And that's why Trump, basically was a breath of fresh air. We always have, people don't get it. Donald Trump, when he said that he wants to make America great, okay, he didn't mean that America needed to project even more power on the world stage. What he meant was that let's make America great for American people, especially the average Americans. Okay? So Trump, from that point of view, was as a realist. I can tell you, like, when Trump, in the way that he dealt with China, for example, was a good example. No president in the history of the United States has been as tough on China as Trump was. I mean, I'm talking about, let's say, the last 50 years, okay? We all know that. Yet, all throughout Trump's basically 4 years as president, okay, he and his people were trying to get China to make concessions so that they can basically get a win-win outcome from all this. I mean, I was probably the only person on Wall Street who actually read the 100-page, basically, agreement that China and basically the US signed, okay, at the end of basically, the beginning of 2020, after 2 years of hard negotiation. You should read that document because I think the document should be enshrined because it was a win-win outcome for both China and the US. In fact, I can tell you in 2019 when I was traveling China, Chinese people will come up to me in the corridor, in the offices, government buildings saying, well, David, you know what? We love Trump here in China because Trump, we are now pushing forward reforms that have been basically held back for the last 10 years. So Trump understood, like a good businessman, if you want to get something from the other side, you have to be willing to give something to the other side. Now, that is, and by the way, Trump also understood one thing, which was that the worst thing that could ever happen to the US is if Russia and China got into bed together, right? Because these are the two most formidable basic adversaries for the US. The last thing you want to see is for these two basically to join forces. This is why every time Trump saw Xi Jinping, he would say, wow, Xi Jinping is a great man. He's my best friend. Every time he saw basically Putin, he said, well, Putin is a great man. He's my best friend. As long as Trump was in power, China and Russia did not basically get too close. And then came basically Joe Biden. Okay. Within basically 2 years, now the two most formidable adversaries of the US had basically gone into bed together. And there's no doubt this is going to represent a huge basically
with Tehran.
Right, with Tehran. But let's just say Tehran doesn't even measure in. But the point here is that China and Russia together would really make America run for its money. Because let's think about this, right? China is strong in manufacturing. Russia is strong in natural resources. They don't compete. There's a lot of synergy between them, right? You're talking about the only 3 nations in the world that send basically men into space. It was US, China, and Russia. And now the number 2 and number 3 decided to get together. I mean, China is very strong in engineering. Russia is very strong in basic sciences. If they really put their heads together, you think, they won't be able to actually come up with their own civilian aircrafts to basically challenge Boeing and Airbus. You don't think they'll be able? I mean, China is already the number 1 player in basically in quantum computing and AI. I mean, Russia and China are way ahead of the US in developing hypersonic missiles. I've always said the reason why the US had to basically get Ukraine basically into NATO was because Russia was so ahead of the US in terms of hypersonic missiles that, that the only way the US could actually, maintain some kind of basically balance is by placing missile launchers directly in Ukraine on the Russian border. That was what, by the way, provoked, Putin into invading Ukraine. That much I have absolutely no doubt. I have also absolutely no doubt, and I said this actually even before, basically Hirsch basically said this recently. I said this already 4 months ago, that it was the US that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Not because I have any, secret information, but because it was the only thing that made sense, okay? That the US did not want to give Germany any excuse to negotiate with Russia. So what best to do to basically blow up the one thing that Germany wanted to basically, that could have basically swayed the Germans to enter into some kind of compromise with Russia. So the bottom line here is America right now, in my view, the biggest problem right now is by basically getting itself into this war in Ukraine and now declaring war, pretty much a war on China, is like there's no turning back. Like if Ukraine loses this war, okay, which I think it will, and then probably sooner than later, I think that will be the end of the American hegemony. I mean, this is the greatest ironic, basic twist in American history, that the neocons who got the US into Iraq and Afghanistan, who really ought to have been put away forever, they came back basically in the Biden administration and got US into basically this Ukraine business and now against China. And they now know that if Ukraine loses this war, that will be the end of the American hegemony because nobody would take America seriously after that. I can tell you, I live in Taiwan. I mean, my parents live in Taiwan. I just came back for a visit, okay, to eat some Chinese food. I can tell you in Taiwan, everybody's following the developments in Ukraine because they're saying, we don't want to become the next Ukraine. If Ukraine loses this war, you think Taiwan is going to say, you know what, let's basically, let's trust the Americans and let's basically, like, let's just destroy half the country, a third of the country is going to let? No way. I think this is the biggest decision that BB will have to make. Hopefully you won't have to make the decision too early because right now, obviously, I don't have to tell you, because US has decided to give up on Iran, trying to get a deal, a nuclear deal, I think, the Americans are going to BB and say, you know what? We'll let you have a free hand at dealing with Iran, provided you send your Iron Dome to Ukraine. I think the biggest decision for BB is not so much the judicial reform, it's how it's going to basically play this. Because America's now saying you're either with us or you're against us. That's the message America's sending to all its allies, right? Is Israel, are you with Russia and China or you're with us? And yet there is no question. I can tell you any country, the only countries that are going to do well the next 10 years, 20 years in the world are going to be countries that sit on the fence, that don't get themselves involved in this basically battle. Kissinger has a famous basically phrase. To be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be America's friend is fatal. And I think from that point of view, I think BB understands that only too well. I think that is a sort of a bigger issue here. It's about the multipolar versus the unipolar world, and which side is going to win, and countries that back the right horse, so to speak, will in the end do very well, right? I mean, it's like, Saudi Arabia has already decided. UAE, Saudi Arabia, they decided to basically back Russia and China, right? Right now, the Saudis are importing Russian oil. I mean, Saudis are basically exporting their own oil, but they're importing Russian oil, which they turn into petroleum products where we export. I mean, and someone understands very well. If Russia loses this war, they're going to be next. You think BB doesn't understand that? You think BB doesn't understand that if Ukraine basically wins this war and Putin's out, America is going to say, you know what, next thing we want something to do this, you're basically moving to settlement, we're going to put huge sanctions on you, okay? Because that US against Ukraine has learned how to weaponize economics and sanctions to basically extract, okay, basically the results they want.
If sanctions work now, you're saying that Israel is next.
What I'm saying is that Israel could be next. There will be a lot of other countries on the thing. It would be, because, right now, I don't have to tell you, the neocons, in Washington who are running Biden's agenda, they're not friends of Israel. They've never been really friends of Israel. They're internationalists. I mean, these people, they want to see two-state solutions, And right now, there's nothing to negotiate. There's nobody to negotiate with. We can talk about who's going to win the 2024 elections. If Ukraine wins the war against Russia, then I would argue that Democrats Biden could get reelected. But if Ukraine loses this war, Biden's gone. And then BB doesn't have to worry anymore. This is why the war in Ukraine right now, to me, is going to be very decisive. And I'm hoping that BB won't have to make any decision until the war is over. And then I personally think it's going to be over within the next 3 to 6 months. And I think Russia's going to win this thing and it's going to be all over. But the point here is that it's about basically this balancing act for BB right now.
David Wu, this was an interesting tour of the horizon. Thank you very much for this conversation.
You're welcome.